the primary guardian of Rabaul. Was a air group of Zeros after the first few weeks of the war. So they had to face some pretty doggone good Japanese pilots flying what was then considered a superior fighter. And even then, the B-17s held their own because they were so overbuilt. They ended up being able to, they proved that they could absorb a lot of punishment and still get home. And that was discovered early on, right in the very beginning, that these things could take a beating and would still bring their crew back.
When you talked about this squadron bridging the gap before the American military machine really gets into the Pacific theater and they get reinforced, how long did this period last where they were this vanguard force trying to fly these different missions?
The Kangaroo Squadron was the only American combat squadron in Australia from the third week in February until basically April of 1942. So for a period of a couple of months, they were the lone combat-ready squadron. Gradually, other units showed up. A bomb group of B-26 Marauders, the early ones, came in to Australia and started flying in April of 1942. The B-25 Mitchell, a couple of units started flying those also in April of 42. But it was piecemeal. You'd get maybe a bomb group here, bomb group there, with a couple of squadrons being ready for combat. One squadron of the Army version of the Dauntless dive bomber. In the Army, they call it the A-24. In the Navy, they called it the SBD Dauntless. So the Army version flew out of New Guinea starting in late April, early May. And then kind of a mediocre fighter, the P-39 Airacobra, and some P-40 Kitty Hawks, Warhawks, which the Aussies called the Kitty Hawk. They were just kind of piecemeal squadrons getting outfitted. And so a little bit here, a little bit there. It took months for the Allies to build up any kind of considerable air strength in Australia or New Guinea, basically a squadron at a time. So really all the way through the first half of 1942, American efforts for bombing and aerial strength and so forth were just piecemeal. That's the best you could say.
Well, there's a lot of missions that I'm interested in, but one in particular I have to ask about is the Kangaroo Squadron rescuing Douglas MacArthur and his staff. So what was that about?
That's right. Rescue might be a little bit of a misleading term. Evacuation would probably be a more appropriate description, but they're close. I mean, you could argue for either one. And the whole story of this was that, MacArthur was, the handwriting was on the wall in Washington. The Joint Chiefs and the military advisors could see that the Philippines was a lost cause. President Roosevelt literally ordered MacArthur to evacuate, to leave Corregidor, where he had holed up with his immediate staff and his family, and get to Australia. So at first, MacArthur argued about not leaving. He didn't want to be seen as leaving his troops in the lurch. He knew it was going to look bad, but he had to follow the president's orders. And eventually then he did leave Corregidor. He was evacuated, he and his family and staff, on four PT boats led by Lieutenant Commander John Bulkeley. They got all the way down to the big island of Mindanao, where the staff, MacArthur and his staff, waited for several days for some B-17s to come in and pick them up. The first attempt had failed to get them by bomber from Australia. The second attempt then involved the Kangaroo Squadron starting out with 4 B-17s, and they ended up only getting 2 that could make it all the way up to the Philippines from Australia, which is a very long flight. But these 2 pilots, Bill Lewis and Frank Bostrom, and their crews picked up MacArthur and his staff on the night of March 16th and 17th and took them down to Australia, to Darwin, or just below Darwin, and got them out safely. And so then MacArthur was able to prosecute the war from his new headquarters, first starting in Melbourne and then later moving up to Brisbane. So they were instrumental in getting him out of the harm's way and helping him set up new headquarters.
There's a lot of other missions that the squadron goes on, of long-range bombing raids and armed reconnaissance missions. Were there any others that stuck out to you?
The missions to surveil Guadalcanal were really important. This squadron had some of the first photo reconnaissance missions over Guadalcanal because they had the range to go all the way from Australia or New Guinea out to Guadalcanal, which is, man, it's like 700 nautical miles out from New Guinea, a pretty long flight. So a long round trip, and they had cameras mounted in the belly, in the Bombay area. They had vertical cameras, and so some of these planes, would get out there, fly at reasonably low level, and photograph what was going on. So you could say the squadron was, number one, instrumental in discovering this airfield under construction by the Japanese on Guadalcanal, which got everybody's attention, and plans were changed. And so then Guadalcanal became the focus of America's first amphibious landing, its first big offensive of the war. So once again, here's the Kangaroo Squadron involved right in the middle of that. They were also involved in the Battle of the Coral Sea with an interesting mission where they accidentally bombed a friendly force of warships. Thankfully, they missed. The bombs didn't hit anything except seawater, which was a blessing in disguise because they were trying to hit what they thought was a big Japanese warship. And it turned out to be the Australian cruiser Australia, surrounded by a screening force of cruisers and destroyers. So in that case, it was a good thing that high altitude bombing against ships was generally just a crapshoot. It was not a real accurate science.
For researching of this book, I understand that you were able to get much more personal accounts than just archival records, and your uncle was in the Kangaroo Squadron. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep. He was a navigator. I knew the basics of his story most of my life, but really not too many of the details. And then shortly before he passed away, I temporarily took possession of his personal diary, a day-to-day journal that he kept, beginning when he got to Hawaii in December of 1941, a couple weeks after the attack. And it continued all the way through his complete deployment, his full overseas tour with that squadron that ended in November of 1942. There were a few pages missing. It's a big mystery in the family as to why those dates are missing, but it didn't seem to have anything super important. But the entries that we did find were really fascinating. I mean, he wrote a lot of detail about some of his combat missions and about living conditions and other things like that. So that was a fascinating find. And I was able to track down other squadron members whose sons or daughters had kept diaries. So just from a long effort, I was able to contact a lot of other personnel or get their diaries and their input. I would say I'd have to look at the bibliography again, but I guess I have about a half a dozen personal diaries from squadron members, and then a lot of photos, collections, and letters, and other things like that. I really like those primary sources.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, those personal accounts are interesting because I love how people will state something so nonchalantly that from their perspective is normal, but from an outside observer seems shocking. Were there any things like that jumped out at you, whether from your uncle or other diaries?
Oh, sure. I mean, you could be reading along about somebody complaining about how he felt while he had dengue fever, which afflicted a big group of the squadron for a few weeks. And for example, there's an attorney in Texas, a friend of mine named Ken Fields. His dad was John Wallace Fields, one of the pilot, first a co-pilot and then later a pilot in the squadron, and kept some interesting observations about being sick in a little outback hospital in this tiny, dusty little town of Cloncurry, where the squadron was deployed to kind of hide from the Japanese early on. And, if you've seen, like the Crocodile Dundee movies and you see the little saloon in that movie, you get a pretty apt description of what this dusty little town was like in the outback where the squadron stayed. And here about 20 or 25 guys are sick with dengue fever, and they're all in this little open air ward in this hospital. There's one doctor in the entire territory. I mean, that's how remote this place is. And he comes very rarely to visit the hospital. So these patients are all under the care of some nurses. And it's kind of funny to read, their comments. And I know that later on, the pilot of the plane that we've referred to as the Swamp Ghost, that we were talking about earlier, he ends up with malaria in a hospital near Brisbane, and he's complaining about the nurses. Said there wasn't one good-looking one among the whole bunch, and so he's stuck there. He's basically on his week of leave, he's stuck in a hospital. So you get some kind of interesting color about the frustrations that these guys endured, and some of the scares that they endured. And it's hard to remember sometimes that these guys were in their 20s, early 20s. There weren't teenagers per se in the group. As I mentioned, all of the Kangaroo Squadron personnel had joined the Army before Pearl Harbor. So there weren't any real youngsters in the group, but they were still young. Early to mid-20s would be the average age. And I stop and think about my own son, who's 24 and on active duty in the Navy, and I'm thinking that was the same age those guys were back in World War II. And it's amazing to think of what they endured, what they accomplished, how they basically sucked it up and did what they had to do under terrible conditions.
Well, thanks for sharing these stories of I would think, mostly forgotten aspect of World War II. Just looking out at the big picture, what do you think the legacy of the Kangaroo Squadron is?
They were the tip of the spear, literally, when we got involved in the Pacific War. As I mentioned earlier, they were the first Army unit to go overseas to encounter the Japanese, ready for combat. They helped to hold the line when things were very grim looking for the first weeks and months of the war. They provided a bit of positive news. We needed heroes badly at that time. And the press fell in love with these guys because they were flying these exciting missions and claiming that they were shooting down lots of Japanese planes, even though most of the time they really weren't hitting anything. It still made good publicity and positive news. Like just the fact that we were fighting back and had some courageous Americans putting their finger in the dike, you could say, to stop the flood. I mean, the Japanese aggression and the Japanese onslaught is hard to overestimate. People were really, really afraid, especially in Australia. in 1942, afraid that Australia was going to end up suing for